Good afternoon, educators and everyone present. My name is Nesha Nathania, Itonami Nainggolan from SMAN 83 Jakarta. The motion for today's debate is this House would adopt student loan mechanism in Indonesia. Today, as the first opposition speaker, I firmly oppose this motion. In this debate, I argue that Indonesia should not adopt a student loan mechanism similar to the system widely implemented in countries like the United States because it creates long-term financial burdens and worsens educational inequality. Today, I will prove my case through two major arguments. First, student loans trap young people in long-term debt and financial insecurity. Second, student loan systems worsen inequality because access to education becomes dependent on people's willingness to take financial risks. Before moving further, let me clarify several important things. Student loans are not free education assistance, they are debt. Students borrow money to pay for tertiary education and are required to repay both the principal and accumulated interest after graduation. The proposition may frame the system as expanding educational access. However, I believe that access built on debt is not truly accessible, especially in a developing country like Indonesia, where economic inequality remains significant. I am not arguing that higher education funding is unimportant. Of course, it is important. However, burdening students with debt should not become the state's primary solution. Now let us move to my first argument. My first argument is that student loan systems trap young people in long-term financial insecurity. Ladies and gentlemen, education is supposed to improve people's future. However, under a student loan mechanism, many students begin adulthood already burdened by debt. This creates enormous pressure immediately after graduation. Instead of focusing on career development, entrepreneurship, or financial stability, graduates are forced to prioritize the debt repayment. This is especially dangerous because employment opportunities are never guaranteed. Not every graduate immediately gets a stable, high-paying job. In countries with competitive labor markets and economic instability, many graduates struggle with unemployment or low salaries for years. As a result, student loans can become lifelong financial burdens. More importantly, interest accumulation worsens the problem. Even when graduates are unable to pay immediately, interest continues increasing over time. This creates cycles of debt that become increasingly difficult to escape. We can clearly observe this in countries like the United States, where millions of graduates continue paying student debts many years even after finishing university. Many delay buying homes, starting businesses, getting married, or building savings because large portions of their income are constantly used for debt repayment. Now imagine implementing a similar system in Indonesia. Indonesia still has major issues regarding income inequality, underemployment, and unstable job markets. Many graduates already struggle to find decent jobs even without debt. Adding financial obligations immediately after graduation would only worsen economic pressure on young people. Furthermore, student loans transfer educational responsibility from the state to individuals. Instead of ensuring affordable education as a public responsibility, the government effectively tells students, if you want education, you must risk your financial future. This is unfair because education should empower citizens, not financially trap them. Therefore, student loan systems do not truly solve educational problems. They simply postpone financial burdens into the future and place those burdens directly on students. Now moving on to my second argument. Student loan mechanism worsen educational inequality because poor students are less willing and less able to take financial risks. Ladies and gentlemen, supporters of student loans often claim that loans increase access to university because students can borrow money even when they cannot pay upfront. However, this argument ignores psychological and economic realities. For wealthy families, taking loans may feel manageable because they have financial safety nets. But for lower-income families, debt is terrifying. Poor students know that if they fail to get stable jobs after graduation, their entire family might suffer financially. As a result, many talented students from disadvantaged backgrounds may avoid university altogether because they are afraid of long-term debt. In other words, access technically exists but practically becomes unequal. This creates a system where education is no longer based primarily on talent and academic ability, but on willingness to gamble financially. This is deeply problematic. Furthermore, student loans can pressure students into choosing careers based on salary rather than passion or social contribution. Graduates become more likely to prioritize jobs that pay enough to repay debt quickly. As a result, sectors with low salaries but important social roles such as teaching, social work, or public service may become less attractive. This negatively affects society in the long run. Additionally, once universities know students can access loans, tuition fees often increases over time because institutions realize that students can borrow money. Educational costs become less controlled. Again, we can observe this in countries with large student loan systems where tuition prices continue rising significantly. This means student loans do not necessarily make education more affordable. Instead, they may normalize expensive education while shifting the burden onto students themselves. In developing countries like Indonesia, this can seriously worsen inequality because wealthier students can remain protected while poorer students carry heavier financial risks. Therefore, instead of creating equal opportunity, the student loan mechanisms may actually deepen social and economic inequality. Now, the proposition may argue that student loans increase access to education for students who cannot afford a university upfront. However, access built on debt is not genuine educational inequality because students are still required to pay eventually, often with additional interest and long-term financial consequences. The proposition may also argue that graduates can repay loans once they obtain jobs, but this assumes stable employment and sufficient salaries are guaranteed, which is unrealistic in many economic conditions, especially in developing countries. More importantly, even if some students succeed financially afterward, the system still normalizes the idea that young people must begin adulthood under debt simply to receive education. I believe education should function as social investment, not financial punishment. Therefore, when comparing temporary educational access versus long-term financial insecurity and inequality, the opposition side clearly provides stronger protection for students and society. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of this debate, the real question is not whether higher education is important. Of course it is. The real question is, should access to education require young people to risk years of debt and financial insecurity? But in student loan systems may appear helpful in the short term, but in reality, they place enormous financial pressures on graduates and worsen inequality for vulnerable communities. Education should create freedom and opportunity, not lifelong debt. Because student loan mechanisms burden young generation economically and socially. This House should reject the motion. Thank you.